I've been rereading Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples. And what struck me about it is most historians will write about the American Revolution or the Roman Republic or, some specific time period. And here's Churchill writing about this 2,000-year sweep of history. And what you get out of it is this sense of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. This long, long battle to try to get to where they got to politically and in terms of their government, and through them, where we got. So I also looked at my horoscope this morning. I don't believe them, but sometimes they're enjoyable. And they'll say things, I know some night I'll be working till 9 o'clock and they'll say, take a break tonight and go out with your friends. And thanks, and really great. You know what this morning said? Talk less, listen more. So I hope you've got a lot to say today. Anyway, this one's a little tough because you could recite history, and you guys didn't sign up for a course, and you've had a nice lunch, and if you're my age, you'd start to fall asleep pretty quickly. But we've got to cover a lot of history to do this. And I'm going to try to explain the development of the rule of law and then kind of bring up some of the issues that are there today, because there are a bunch of them in the world relating to this. The interesting thing to me is, for some people, when they think of this, they think of it strictly as idea, and that's half of it. But the other half is a nitty-gritty, dirty battle for things. And so there's both the set of factual things and the ideas. When I was doing my dissertation, I did both a normative, theoretical part, but I also then tested that empirically. Well, professors in the poli-sci departments were of 2 types. They were the theoreticians or the empiricists, and they didn't believe the other guy's stuff was worth anything. So what I ended up with is people on the committee who thought half the dissertation was complete junk and the other half was brilliant, except vice versa. And so that made it kind of hard to do. So I admit to you, I'm pretty much a dualist, and I think these 2 things flow along. We're going to start with Aristotle, because almost anything that our lives are dependent on today start with Aristotle. And we'll talk about his ideas, but you have to understand he didn't pull his stuff out of thin air either. He lived in an Athens where magistrates and juries existed, drawn by lottery from the assembly, which was formed of citizens. They had commercial law, and the principle of binding and enforceable contracts among equal citizens was enforced. You see what I mean? This isn't just stuff that he abstractly came up with. But the principle, as he looked at different forms of government, this is what he came down to. These are generally the most important pieces out of him. Government should govern for the good of the people, not for those in power. And he saw this as almost like natural law. The whole idea of natural law comes back later. But good government was, in his mind, virtually the kingdom of God on earth. Interesting? He also concluded that mixed regimes, meaning ones that were not dominated by, a large group of the poor or the oligarchy or a military elite, were better because they're more stable. And he thought a pure democracy could very easily turn into a tyranny of the majority. He said, governments which have a regard to the common interest are constituted in accordance with strict principles of justice and are therefore true forms, but those which regard only the interest of the rulers are all defective and perverted forms, for they are despotic. He who bids the law rule may be deemed to bid God and reason alone rule, but he who bids the man rule adds an element of the beast, for desire is a wild beast, and passion perverts the minds of rulers, even when they are the best of men. The law is reason unaffected by desire. That whole idea that man is a beast comes back in the Enlightenment, and you'll see it in what the American founders thought too. He says, the best political community, this is very interesting because frankly, I hadn't even read this part before in Aristotle. It says, the best political community is formed by citizens of the middle class, and that those states are likely to be well administered in which the middle class is large and stronger, if possible, than both the other classes. For the addition of the middle class turns the scale and prevents either of the extremes from being dominant. Okay? Very interesting. And we'll relate that one to today, too. Now, the scene moves from Greece to Rome. And I've done some traveling over the last few years. This is my bucket list stuff, places I've wanted to go forever. I was in Eastern Europe this past summer. And wherever you go, the importance of Rome just jumps out at you. And Regensburg, Germany, and you walk up from the river, and here's this arch built in 179 by the Roman soldiers. Why? Because that's real wild territory on the other side, okay? This is the edge of civilization. And whether you stop in Vienna, and you see the Romans. I didn't appreciate that. Didn't appreciate the contributions of the Romans for a long time. But this is from Churchill. He says, the gift which Roman civilization had to bestow was civic and political. Towns were planned in chessboard squares for communities dwelling under orderly government. The buildings rose in accordance with the patterns standardized throughout the Roman world. Each was complete with its forums, temples, courts of justice, jails, baths, markets, and main drains. So one of the things about the Roman, they were city dwellers. Think about what most of the world was like at that time. It was not farmers and hunter-gatherers. And town dwellers have things like courts. So the Brits got used to that sort of thing. And Roman law survived pretty strongly in the Byzantine Empire. In the western part, so many terrible things happened that much was destroyed. So I'm skipping hundreds of years here, and there are a lot of side places that would be fun to go, but I'm going to try to avoid all the side paths today. From about 442 on, the Dark Ages settled over Britain, and they were so dark. It's almost inconceivable to a modern to understand how much was lost and how dark things were. For 400 years, how many original documents do you think are left out of that British history? Not things written 500 years later, but things written then. 400 years. 4. That's all. Think if we went back to 1715 to today, and there were 4 documents about the United States. I mean, it was incredibly dark. Some of you may have read a book. How many have read How the Irish Saved Civilization? Okay. The Irish were extremely important because monks there preserved much of that knowledge and the writing, the ancient knowledge, and then later took that back to the rest of Europe. So during this period, there were local kings. Christianity came in. There were places where some bright lights emerged, like a Charlemagne in about 800, excuse me. And in England, finally, you began to get some consolidation with the Saxon kings. And there was a court. Early Middle Ages, it was the king's court. But these things did not give you substantive rights the way you think of, if you're talking to a policeman, I have rights. No, it wasn't like that. What you had was procedures. If something had gone badly for you, there were certain procedures you could go through at the king's court. That didn't guarantee you anything. A lot of the rules were very much like the Germanic people of Northern Europe. Local customs governing, meaning lots of differences throughout the whole area. Crime was dealt with largely by compensation. You killed somebody, that's going to cost you 2 cows. Okay? Juries did exist. There were ordeals. You might have to go through an ordeal to prove your innocence. And there were writs. Everybody know what a writ is? It's an order to appear, so that they could call somebody and say, you got to come to this. You are part of this story. So then the Normans come, 1066. And the Normans speak French, but they're not French. What are they? Yeah, they're Scandinavians. They had settled in Normandy 150 years before. They don't bring a lot of lawyers and judges. That's not their way. Okay? But there were things that were retained. The counties, sheriffs, and courts did survive under them. And there was an adjustment going on. You know, at first they imposed themselves, and then they began to incorporate the Anglo-Saxon and bring them into the system. So 1215, we get to the Magna Carta. Everybody has heard of that. But basically, what was it saying? Well, it was the nobles getting the king to agree that there were certain things he was going to have to pay attention to. Now, here's one of the most famous articles. No freeman shall be taken or imprisoned, or seized, or exiled, or in any way destroyed, nor will we go upon him, nor send upon him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. That sounds like rule of law, doesn't it? But it didn't apply to everybody. It was freemen, and there weren't, at that point, a whole lot of freemen. The next really significant person in this story would be Henry II. That's about 1154 to 1189. He did a lot of things. Unified England, Scotland, Ireland, consolidated the royal power over the feudal, and established the common law. For a long time, I used to think common law was something that was a bunch of things out there that were just accumulated. Not really. The customary stuff was overtaken by the common law. The common law was the application of a same standard across places that had different approaches to things. And to some degree, that also replaced Roman law, because even when things got dark, people did fall back, and there was still Roman law in places, and they used it where they could. The Churchill quote, "This was a slow change over 35 years of rule. Slowly he replaced trial by battle and other means to trial by jury. Early on, these juries were not the modern sort, where the jurors didn't know anything about the case of the people, but the opposite. It was a jury of people who actually knew the people and the case itself. Slowly, the custom of royal courts became institutionalized, and out of that period, a law of the land developed." So one of the things that Henry did was to centralize the judiciary, and then he did something interesting with it. He sent it out circuit riding. So you extended the king's, you know, for Americans, we always think of the king as that's the bad guy. Not necessarily in English history, because often it was the kings who provided better justice than the local guy, who might just be running roughshod over you. And so it was the king's justice that often that people wanted, and they wanted that common law. Next would be Edward I, and he's been called the English Justinian. Justinian was the Byzantine emperor who collected all the law that he could find in a set of things called the Institutes, and really it was sort of the first compilation of all the law that they knew of at that time. But under Edward, there was a Statute of Westminster, and that made juries compulsory in all criminal cases. The old systems are gone at that point. And the Statute of Gloucester, which limited some of the local court jurisdiction. Law of equity came in. One of the problems with the law people find sometimes is you follow ... and you get to the end, you say, that result isn't fair. It makes no damn sense at all. That's what equity is about. It's about, okay, let's take a look at this. But equity's tricky, because what's fair to you is not the same as what's fair to you, right? So they developed petitions of relief, and that went into the chancery. Understand at that time, a lot of the times when you had problems, you had to do a petition. And that petition, because there wasn't a law about it, but you're asking for some kind of relief. And there was still Roman law on things like trespass and dispossession, same kind of law that had existed from pre-Christian days. Statute law, the way we know it, really doesn't develop until about the 16th century. It doesn't mean there weren't any, but statute law at that time was primarily coming out of the king. It wasn't coming out of Parliament. But one of the things that Edward said, very, very interesting, because it goes right to this basic point we're talking about today. We must find out what is ours and due to us, and others what is theirs and due to them. So part of what I'm trying to say to you is, in addition to those ideas, the Aristotelian ideas, you've got this thing of, I want to protect what's mine and me. You follow? And so many of these battles are things like that, whether it was the nobles against the king, or later on merchants and others. There's this other thread. It's not about intellectual things. It's about, I need a way to be safe and not be taken down by either government or others. There's a wonderful quote from William Tecumseh Sherman. After they had taken Vicksburg, Grant put him in charge of the administration because he was a very bright guy. And at one point, there were a bunch of people breaking into the warehouses there. So the local owners come around to Sherman, who's sitting at his desk doing paperwork, and they said, General, we've had irregulars breaking in and stealing everything out of our warehouses. Sherman doesn't look up, and he says, call the marshal. And they said, well, sir, there has not been a marshal here since the outbreak of hostilities. And he said, you should have thought of that. That was his point. And in fact, it was his point, it was Grant's point that, rule of law. You guys have broken. Their position to the South was just lay down your arms, there's not going to be any retribution, but you go back and you obey the damn law. That's it. That was their position. Okay. One of the things that I've learned so much from when I was in school, I was always fascinated from very young, reading histories and the politics and all that. But some periods didn't always make sense to me. So I took a course in European economic history. Oh boy, did that open up things. Because it explained, why things happened, why you had corn laws, explained about weather and its impact. Well, the Bubonic Plague had a big impact. It took down so many people all across Europe. But it played out differently in different parts of Europe. In England, what happened was that it created a shortage of workers. And the workers were able to leverage that into more power against the owners. Okay? And it changed in other parts of Europe. If you go farther east, the feudal lords were able to control and keep those people down. But in England, they began to have more power as freemen. In Western Europe, and in England in particular, peasants were more successful in reducing the power of the feudal lords, and subsequently, wages started to rise and labor mobility increased. All right, now we're going to get up into the 17th century. This is where an awful lot happens. In 1744, a man named Samuel Rutherford changed what had been the traditional way of saying something. It was the king, rex, is law, lex. He said, lex is rex. The law is the king. Okay? Well, this was during that whole battle between the Roundheads and the Loyalists. The Brits went through a terrible civil war from, 1641 to about 1650. And during that time, a number of important things happened. But coming out of that, they found that the Long Parliament, the Parliament of the Roundheads, was, to most of them, worse than what they had under the king. So they brought King's son back. The problem is, he still wanted to enforce, not the first one, the second, wanted to enforce Catholicism, and the rest of them weren't so crazy about that idea. So we get, in 1688, what's called the Glorious Revolution. They bring William of Orange and Mary, who was actually an English princess, back to be the king. And at that point, they established the primacy of Parliament over the king, that the king cannot act, he cannot tax, he can't do any of those things without Parliament. In the past, he had to go to Parliament on taxation things, but now Parliament really became supreme. So you get the Habeas Corpus Act in 1679, and that basically says that everybody, including the local sheriffs, etc., have got to follow the law. If you get a writ from the court, you got to follow it. You don't get to decide not to. And then we get the English Bill of Rights and the Petition of Right. See, the Brits do not have a constitution in one place like ours. Their constitution is the Magna Carta plus the Petition of Right plus habeas corpus. It's a whole bunch of things that make up the British Constitution. But we're now to the point, the time of the Enlightenment, and there's some really important characters here, any one of which would be fascinating to talk about. You've got probably the first of them, John Locke. Hugely important political thinker. He was a doctor, actually, a physician. And then Newton, same time. At this time, people didn't make a distinction between scientist and philosopher. They were all considered themselves natural philosophers. That break comes a little later. Voltaire, who says some absolutely brilliant things about what's going on. He got kicked out of France at one point, ran for his life, went to England, and he admired what the English had, and what he liked so much was their ability to get along with each other with different religions by the time he went. And he writes a wonderful piece about, he goes to the British Stock Exchange and he sees Jews and Church of England and Catholics, and they're all doing business together. And part of his conclusion was, commerce makes you behave better. And he was trying to explain that to the French. You know, just the nature of commerce causes everybody to have to deal with each other. And then also Montesquieu. So I'm going to jump to the American Revolution now, where these threads of both the ideas and the battling, this whole battle that's gone on in Britain for, at that point, 700 years to get to where they were, come together. Now, Adams and Jefferson, were the two big antagonists. Didn't really care for each other very much until they retired and began to write some. But both of them, in their writings, say, who influenced me the most? Who's most influential on what we did in America? Aristotle, Cicero, Locke. Now they'll mention some others, but they always agree on those three. So we're back to Mr. Aristotle again. This was an age of reason, and people today do not understand how those guys thought. They were deists. Does anybody know really what deists are like? Deists believe in God. They believe in God the Creator. They do not believe he did anything after that. Created, walks away. Okay? Don't believe in miracles. Think of how much of the Bible that wipes out. Quite a bit. But rule of law for them is like Aristotle. It is a natural thing. There is a natural order that ought to exist, and you have to perceive that and put in the rule of law, and then you will have this near kingdom of God on earth. But also, man is an animal. But he can behave well if you give him the right system. You ever heard that story from farmers about pigs? Depending on how you set up their area, it could be awful or it can be not bad at all. That's the way they looked at it. So constitutional arrangements were agreements to abide by fundamental procedural norms. And another approach they use in justifying the rule of law in the Constitution comes from this Enlightenment assumption that society arranged around certain models tend to work better. So Madison, the guy, he didn't write the whole Constitution. That overdoes it. But he was more important than anybody else in the writing of it. He studied all these constitutions throughout history and thought about what things would work. And what he comes up with is something that's more mixed, like what Aristotle wanted. Checks and balances, 3 different parts of the government. But there's also a presumption that got here too. And folks, this makes it really hard in some areas of the world. It presupposed the existence of certain morals, traditional practices for both individuals and groups. You know, I mentioned Washington before because I spoke about him, but he was one of those deists. He would actually get up if communion was served and walk out. Didn't believe in it. But he thought religion was very important. Quote, he mentions God a lot in his speeches. And he considered that religion was absolutely necessary as a set of traditions and mores for the way people could act. That the laws wouldn't work if you didn't have people who had certain beliefs and behaved in certain ways. And while the framers believed that rights were in the abstract real, they also recognized that rights had no protection outside of a society's norms and conventions. Madison said this, "Public opinion sets the bounds to every government, and it is the real sovereign in every free one." What I always liked about our founders was, you know, other people who've tried to found governments decide, you're all going to have to behave the way I tell you, and I'm going to control that. Ours were more about channeling behavior. Does that make any sense? If you behave in certain ways, things will go nicely for you. If you don't, you're going to have a tougher time of it. And Adams probably gave this rule of law definition the best it can be given. He wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, first one to actually put public education in. And he said, "To the end that it may be the government of laws, not of men." Okay? Pretty clear. Now, just saying something's a law doesn't quite settle it, does it? How about Nazi Germany? Did you ever hear of the Nuremberg laws? I mean, laws that took away the rights of Jews and others, that allowed courts to send people to be killed. Well, you know, the first time Hitler was popularly elected. He didn't win a majority, but his party managed to get in power. It was very hard for a lot of Germans to fight this whole thing because it was legal. The judges were making those decisions. But is that right? Is it proper? So we've got a bunch of modern issues to deal with. One of them, I think, is administrative law. Because it is the case today that somebody like an EPA could come in and effectively do a taking of everything you own by a certain judgment. So part of the rule of law is a person has to have some way to challenge that, to challenge an administration. Talked about the Nazis. You can also talk about unjust laws here. How about all the Jim Crow laws we had? Pretty hard to defend. James Wilson at the Philadelphia Convention said, "Laws may be unjust, may be unwise, may be dangerous, may be destructive, and yet not be so unconstitutional as to justify judges in refusing to give them effect." And we've always had this little battle going on in our own system. You know, when is it so bad that it's unconstitutional? Or when is it just, that's a stupid law, but that's a legislature's problem to fix? Okay? And we still grapple with that. Then we get into things like Sharia law. Sharia law is antithetical to this whole stream that we've talked about here, of rule of law. And one of the things I fault the president on is you can't just get up and talk about, oh, the latest atrocity. We have to articulate why what we believe is better. And I think women are a big part of that. There's a huge theme there. You're not going to convince the terrorists. You're not going to convince the Al-Qaeda types. But you've got to express that to those people who are not Western Civ folks. You know, show them why what we believe in and why this thread is better, why it produces better lives for everybody. Developing countries. I've been fascinated by the problems for developing countries. When we went through the Industrial Revolution, some of our ancestors had it really hard. I mean, they had terrible circumstances, worked in awful factories, unsafe, dirty, and yet they did it. It's harder today because when they did it, there wasn't anything better. Where do you look in the world where anything was better? It wasn't. But now, and certainly since the middle of the 20th century, people can pick up a paper, or today, anything, and see that there are people living pretty darn well someplace else. So it's harder to get through those initial steps when you really have to not provide a whole lot of services in order for a country to get its development going. They also did not have the 800 years that Britain had. And you need the rule of law really to get investment and development. I'll tell you a little story. This one is funny because it makes me sound way more important than I am. I was in Washington, D.C., and I got a message that the Laotian ambassador wanted to see me. Okay. And I couldn't figure out. Well, what it turned out is he wanted to talk about economic development. They're communists, by the way. But he wanted to talk about economic development. He'd asked somebody, and they said, do you know anybody? And somebody said, who happened to know me, said, oh, Tim Witsman's in town. I'll get him to come. So I went over and had dinner with him. And it was fascinating. He spent the dinner talking about how horrible it was that Laos had been governed by the French and not the British. What was behind that? It was what the British left. The British, not all the places the Brits were worked out, but they did leave behind this tradition of rule of law, some infrastructure, how you do things, okay? And they didn't get that. So he was very bitter about the French. But then we got down to it, and he was talking about they wanted, to be, the way you start on this stuff typically is like tourist hotels and things like that, vacation places. So he's asking me, what should we do? What's the most important thing we could do to begin to really develop? Well, not being politically correct, I told him the truth. I said, you can institute an Anglo-Saxon legal system. That's the most important thing you could do, because that will get you the credibility and the belief and the investment. It's not what he wanted to hear, and I never heard from him again. But do you understand? I mean, that was more important than any other, trick of economic development. That's what matters. Latin America. There's some fascinating things going on in the developing world. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but a lot of the economists in Latin America were trained at Harvard or MIT. They went back and they looked at their, what are the problems in development? And what they found, one of the most important things they found, was that poor people actually had more assets than anybody thought they had. The problem is they can't use them. If you're in Egypt and you don't have pull and money, do you know how long it takes you to sell a piece of property? About 12 years. Okay? There are people in Latin America who have lived on their families have lived on land for 200 years. They don't have title to it. Anybody read a book called 1893? Very interesting book. It talks about the spread of things after Columbus, spread of plants. He talks about Malaysia, where he's hearing these kids sing a traditional song and they're singing about these various crops, and he realizes not one of those is indigenous to Malaysia. Not one. They'd all been brought from some. But the point is, in that book, he also talks about a lady out in the Amazon, and they're just prey to people with more power and money. So they'd have to sell their product whenever they want. Well, she'd managed to get an electric line strung to her house, just along the ground, and she got herself a freezer, so she didn't have to sell on the day they came. All right? And two, she had a phone. So when they came in and said, we've decided that you don't own this land, we do, she called a lawyer, and she was able to fight it and win. That's the problem for much of the third world, that the system is rigged against them, okay? And that gets me to the next issue, which is corruption. Corruption is just, we've tried to leave democracy in a lot of places, but they're so bloody corrupt that it doesn't work. Just doesn't work. I read a piece just recently of a conclusion in Europe. This is big stuff in Europe because as they look at things like expanding the European community, these questions come up. Does this country have rule of law? Is it corrupt? Is it so corrupt that we can't do business with them? And they were talking about Ukraine. Part of Ukraine's problem and its weakness was that it was corrupt, terribly corrupt. So I always take a look, and I don't do this every year, but every couple of years, I'll go out and I'll look at 3 sets of numbers. One is a corruption index that's put out. Which are the most corrupt countries, and it ranks them from 1 to whatever. The second one is economic freedom index, and the third is economic growth. And if you know those first 2, you got a pretty good idea what that third one's going to be. The next thing I would bring up is a danger for us, and that's the loss of the middle class. That we, I think, are getting to a point where, I don't want to quote Mitt Romney, but the 47%, a lot of power there, ability to vote oneself, it's called moral hazard in economics. Vote yourself things that don't cost you anything. But at the same time, also people who have money and power having way too much influence too. And you get both ends of that. And I think the country becomes much worse when that's the case. And so the loss of middle class, and in middle class I tend to include certainly the upper half of what used to be called working class, because they have very similar values and approaches to things. But I'll finish off with rule of law and democracy. Of the 2, first I want rule of law. It's way more important. And historically that tended to be what happened. When many of these big changes were made in England that gave everybody much more freedom, only 2% of the people could vote. It wasn't the democracy that was the most important piece. The thing about democracy is if you don't have it, you probably aren't going to keep the rule of law. You're going to have a system that can keep people entrenched positions from taking over. But you get these awful situations. Take a Haiti, for example. Haiti had a democracy, but it's so incredibly corrupt that things don't work. And I've toyed in my head with the idea, well, what you ought to have is a protectorate, or the UN or something for 1-2 generations. How long would it take for people to get away from corruption, to enforce a more rule-based system? But would that work? Can you do that from outside? I don't know. My point being, in so many of these countries, people did not go through those bloody fights the English did to get there over 800 years. And to expect they're going to do it in a generation is naive, very naive, very hard on them. And they're going to go through a lot of trouble. But I think this is the thread that has brought us to where we are, but we have to be constantly vigilant, and there are dangers, both external dangers and I think internal dangers to our maintenance of a rule of law. And I'll then listen to my horoscope and let you talk, okay?